Bon après-midi, chers.
Good afternoon, colleagues, honorable senators, and welcome to our witnesses.
Senate Committee on Social Affairs, Science and Technology. Mon nom est Chantal Petitclerc, sénatrice du Québec, et c'est un plaisir.
My name is Chantal Leclerc, and I'm a senator for Quebec, and I'm happy to chair this meeting.
For our witnesses, I would like to please ask my colleagues to introduce themselves, and we will begin on my right.
Judith Seidman from Montréal, Québec.
Bienvenue, Rosemary Poirier, Nouveau-Brunswick.
Nikki Eaton, Ontario. Welcome.
Welcome, Mohammed Ravalia, Newfoundland and Labrador.
Victor O, Toronto.
Bienvenue, José Forêt-Nissing du nord de l'Ontario.
Bonjour, Marie-Françoise Mégy, Québec.
Stan Couture, Nova Scotia.
Ratna Omidvar, Toronto.
Rosemary Moody, Toronto.
Donna Dasco, Toronto. Oh, yeah.
Somebody should sit together.
Why not? Why not?
2 months in Ottawa.
Oh, no.
Merci beaucoup. Alors aujourd'hui,
Thank you, everyone. So today we'll be carrying on with the study of our Bill C-81, an act to ensure a barrier-free Canada. It's a great privilege to have you here with us today. Thank you for contributing to the important study of this bill. Today with us, we have from AgeWell, we have Rosalie Wang, Assistant Professor for the Department of Occupational Science and Occupational Therapy from the University of Toronto. And we also have with us Mr. Frank Folino from the Canadian Association of the Deaf.
give you some time for your opening remarks, and it will be followed by questions. And we will begin with you, Mr. Folino.
Thank you for the opportunity to appear before the Standing Committee on Social Affairs, Science and Technology during its study of Bill C-81 and the Accessibility Act, Canada Act. The Canadian Association of the Deaf, Association des Sourds du Canada, is a national non-for-profit organization that promotes accessibility for deaf people who use American Sign Language, ASL, and Langue des Signes du Québécois, LSQ. CAD has been an active member of the leadership team of the Federal Accessibility Legislation Alliance, FALA, which has brought forward needed amendments for Bill C-81, such as timelines, standardization processes for the timely resolution of complaints, and others as well. We commend the Government of Canada and the Minister for introducing Bill C-81, which is an important and positive step towards becoming an accessible Canada. However, an integral part of Bill C-81 will achieve its purposes of a barrier-free Canada with legal recognition of ASL and LSQ as the languages of deaf people, because this does actually make a tremendous difference for deaf Canadians through accessibility to information, communications, and services. Since Canada ratified the CRPD, many other countries have ratified the convention as well. Over 45 countries have already recognized their national sign languages by their governments. Some examples would be Greece, Ireland, Scotland, Italy, Mexico, New Zealand, and many more. But Canada, our country, is not on the list. Also, the convention does clearly recognize sign languages are equal to spoken and written languages that interweaves with other articles of the convention, which mention specific rights to sign languages and accessibility. To achieve accessibility for the deaf people through recognition of ASL and LSQ will allow full participation, protection, and promotion This will allow them to fully exercise their rights and responsibilities in a barrier-free Canada. Some examples of these would be production of ASL and LSQ videos on federal government websites, provision of ASL and LSQ in-person and video interpreting at federal government services, provision of picture-in-picture screen of ASL and LSQ interpretation through broadcast television and digital communications. For example, federal leaders' debates, emergency alert announcements, and any other accessible services. Just for example, recently to note, New Zealand shooting that recently happened. It was a horrific, terrible event, and the Prime Minister of New Zealand announced his broadcast on television with their sign language interpreters side by side, so that the deaf people, deaf citizens of New Zealand, had full access to information in their sign language because their country recognizes their sign language. And they know that they need that in order to be accessible. So Canada can take this opportunity and follow suit amongst other countries in the world. To ensure that these principles that guided the development of the CRPD are nothing about us without us, to remain true to this principle, it is imperative that the Senate amend Bill C-81 and add to Section 6 of the Act the following. All deaf persons must have barrier-free access to full and equal participation in society, recognizing that American Sign Language, ASL, and Langue Distincte Québécoise, LSQ, are languages of persons who are deaf in Canada. That's the amendment we propose to the Senate to consider. We're not asking for official recognition or official languages recognition. This is our language, our culture, our community that will enable us to participate fully in society. And so we propose that to you for your discussion. And furthermore, we also recommend in Section 117 to be amended to require accessibility regulations to advance the purpose and further principles of the Act. This will allow Canada to meet its human rights obligations. The international community is looking forward to attending the Conference of States Parties to the CRPD at UN headquarters in June 2019. I'm eager to join their celebrations as a proud Canadian, and I would like to be able to share or announce at that time that Canada too recognizes ASL and LSQ. Following royal assent, CAD looks forward to working with the Government of Canada on the implementation of the Accessible Canada Act, including legal recognition of ASL, LSQ as the languages of deaf people in Canada. I would be pleased to answer any of your questions. Thank you. Merci beaucoup.
Thank you. Ms. Wang.
Thank you. Thank you for the opportunity to speak today to you on behalf of AgeWell. AgeWell is Canada's Aging and Technology Network, a federally funded network through the Network Centres of Excellence program. As a pan-Canadian network, we include researchers, older adults, caregivers, partner organizations, and trainees whose collective goals is to accelerate the delivery of technology-based solutions that make a meaningful difference to the lives of Canadians. As we are all well aware, Canada's population is aging, and the prevalence of disability increases with age. In 2016, for the first time, more Canadians were 65 years and over than under 15 years of age. While many seniors are healthy and active,
38% of Canadians aged 65 and over report living with a disability. Of Canadians 75 years and over, that's 47%. This is in contrast to 20% of Canadians aged 25 to 64 years who report living with a disability. A barrier-free Canada will significantly assist those aging with a disability, aging into disability, and aging well to fully and equally participate in their valued activities in their communities and in society and promote full citizenship. As such, Age Well fully supports the expeditious passage of Bill C-81. We commend the leadership of this government and Minister Qualtrough for their dedication in tabling this truly landmark bill. We are encouraged by Minister Qualtrough's foresight to accommodate rapidly advancing technology and other innovations in the field of accessibility. AgeWell works to create products and services, for example, applying accessible information and communication technologies to support ease of social interaction between seniors and their families living at a distance, artificial intelligence to help in the early detection of functional or cognitive changes, and robotics to allow people using powered wheelchairs to more safely navigate their communities. We know how quickly technology is advancing. We also know how technology can transform the lives of individuals living with disabilities by equalizing opportunities and facilitating social, economic, and civic participation. We offer 2 points for the committee's consideration. Firstly, we would like to see explicit acknowledgement under the principles of the bill of individuals experiencing multiple forms of discrimination in Canadian society. We would like recognition of the challenges experienced by people who face multiple and compounding forms of discrimination. Particularly, seniors continue to experience pervasive ageism in society. This discrimination is amplified if they are living with a disability and are, for example, women living in poverty. We would like further consideration, as our second point, of the role of personal assistive technology in facilitating full societal inclusion of Canadians living with disabilities, and federal leadership in supporting universal and more equitable access to these technologies. Bill C-81 aims to address barriers pertaining to employment, the built environment, information and communication technologies, and many other areas. But to achieve the goal of a truly inclusive Canada where people with disabilities may benefit from equal opportunities, personal assistive technologies will continue to be necessary. Indeed, multiple stakeholders in our research have indicated the need to better align environmental accessibility initiatives with access to needed technology. For example, having ramps and elevators or accessible transportation services will not be useful to someone who is confined to their home because they do not have an appropriate wheelchair. Or having accessible face-to-face banking services will not be useful to someone who cannot make their wishes known without a customized alternative communication device. There is a significant unmet need for disability supports, which include assistive technologies, with 24% of Canadians aged 15 years and over living with disabilities reporting an unmet need. Access to assistive technologies in Canada is inequitable, with access limited by criteria such as age and disability type in some jurisdictions, which may in effect violate the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms. We acknowledge that the majority of assistive technology funding and service programs are under the purview of provincial or territorial health and social services ministries or departments. However, under Bill C-81, the Minister will have the power, duty, and function to collaborate with these jurisdictions to coordinate efforts as they pertain to accessibility. We urge the Ministry to make it a priority to raise these equity concerns and support a strategy to be collectively developed and adopted that aligns the principles and goals of the Accessible Canada Act and assistive technology programs and services. Thank you again for the opportunity to present our perspectives. On behalf of AgeWell, we look forward to working with the federal government and contributing our network's collective expertise to creating a truly barrier-free Canada.
Thank you. Thank you both for your opening remarks. We do have questions for you. I want to remind my colleagues that we will try to keep the questions and answers under 5 minutes. So the shorter the preamble, the more answers you get. I have on that list Senatrice Seidman, Eaton, Ravalia, O, Meji, Deacon, and Poirier, and Senator Munson. So Senatrice Seidman.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you both very much for your presentations. Ms. Wang, if I could start with you, please. You talked about the multiple and complex forms of discrimination that older people would experience. And if I look at data from the Canadian Survey on Disabilities, people 65 to 74, 26% of them suffer disabilities, and 75 and over, 42.5% suffer disabilities. That's fairly old data. I'm not sure if you have newer data to correct that. But you're looking to see, right?
Yes.
It's important because those are very big numbers, and I would like to feel assured that this legislation represents issues that seniors have to deal with, and that they feel it addresses their needs as well. So I guess I'm asking you, do you think that this legislation addresses the needs of seniors? And are there barriers that are unique to Canadian seniors with a disability?
So the statistics that I cited were from the most recent disability survey from 2017 that was reported just late last year. And so those are accurate. So 38% 65 and over report having a disability, and 75 years and older, that percentage is 47. And that is almost for the seniors over 75, that's almost double in terms of the numbers. Or actually, sorry, for the 65 and older, it's almost double that of the younger working age cohort. For the Accessible Canada Act, having a barrier-free, accessible Canada will help seniors and everybody in the community who has any form of disability. And I think even though there are quite a lot, even though there is quite a lot still to be done through the regulations, I think passing the bill is an excellent start.
I appreciate that. I think we all appreciate that, and we'd like to feel that seniors' needs are addressed at the very outset with this legislation. Is there something that we're not getting? Are there particular disabilities that seniors have to deal with on a daily basis that could be facilitated through an amendment, for example, in this legislation?
Looking at the recent, more expanded version of the definition of disability that includes mental and cognitive, intellectual and learning disabilities, I think that does cover potentially the areas around changes in cognition related to dementia, for example. So I think looking at the definition of disability, that in itself is already as inclusive as we, I think, can make it at this time. Yeah.
Thank you very much. I really appreciate that. Do I have any more time, or am I out?
You do have 2 minutes.
Oh, 2 minutes. Good. Then perhaps I could just ask you, Mr. Folino, thank you so much for being with us. And you made it very clear in no uncertain terms how important recognition of the ASL LSQ language is to the deaf community. I wondered if there was a particular location in this legislation that you would like to see that reference made. So is it under basic principles? Is it at the very outset of the act? Is there a particular place in the legislation that would make you feel happier as sort of a basic recognition?
Thank you, Senator Seidman, for your question. During my presentation, I proposed a specific amendment to be placed in Section 6.
Oh, I missed it. Okay.
And then to add there that all deaf persons must have a barrier-free access to full and equal participation in society, recognizing that American Sign Language, ASL, and Langue de Signes Québécoise, LSQ, are languages of persons who are deaf in Canada. And so we feel that that fits nicely in Section 6. And so that's the rationale, for our reasoning for proposing it in Section 6. But if you have an idea of where it could be better placed, if that's not suitable, then we're open to that discussion.
Oh, I think that's really helpful. I'm sorry, I clearly missed the Section 6 piece because I was so taken with your very demonstrative suggestion for an amendment. You were absolutely crystal clear, and I really appreciate that. And I think Section 6 is the principal section, if I'm correct. So I totally understand that you would want it in basic principles in this legislation.
Yes, that's right.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Question from the sponsor of the bill, Senator Munson.
Well, thank you very much for being here. Compelling it is, and important it really is for us to pay attention to what you have told us. And I hope we do that in clause by clause tomorrow. Two questions. Well, short one is, in the deaf community, what is the percentage of our population in this country that would benefit from an enhanced bill?
Thank you, Senator Munson, for your question. We don't have an exact, accurate, or recent data, but our estimation there's 370,000 culturally deaf people in Canada. So our calculation comes from 1/10 of the population. And we also have hard of hearing individuals who sign and other community members who also use a sign language. So a total, I feel our rough estimate would be 3 million. So once the language is recognized, ASL and LSQ, it will enable Stats Canada to put proper questioning in place within the census so that we can get accurate data of people who are deaf, who use ASL and LSQ.
Thank you. Jobs are very important to everyone. And what we've heard in the disability community, of course, is the jobless rate is extremely high because there is the systemic discrimination. I'm not going to hire you. I'm just going to look the other way because I can find somebody else to do this job. In this bill, or in any operations that this bill covers, would this bill, with your recommendation, enhance the opportunity for people to seek full employment, either in the public service or working or associated with anything involved with the public service?
Again, thank you for your question. Absolutely. Currently, the unemployment rate for deaf Canadians is almost 60% of our population, of our community. If this bill is passed and we recognize ASL and LSQ, it will provide ample opportunity for employment. Minister Qualtrough, Minister of Public and Procurement Services, mentioned that there would be 5,000 new jobs made as a result of this bill passing. So then this will enable, if you're going to allow access to ASL and LSQ, it will allow them to then work. And so for another example would be Service Canada. And if they were going to get their passport renewed, they could get video remote interpreting services, an app, and log on to that app, and then get access to interpreters. As well as if there are deaf individuals working within Service Canada, servicing the general public, and someone from the general public comes up to Seek My Services. They can also use BRI, Access an Interpreter, Video Remote Interpreter, and that removes those barriers and allows us that equality and to work on par with other Canadian citizens. So definitely this bill is heading in the right direction in the first step to full accessibility, whether accessing government services or being employed by the federal government. That will allow a benchmark to increase the job market for deaf people.
Thank you again. Just very briefly.
Yes.
The word may and must has been an argument that's been going on in our committee, and whether the government may do something or must do something. I'm intrigued by the announcement that you made about the New Zealand Prime Minister and that there was a person doing interpretation. So I would guess in your view that even when we do our report and we have a news conference about this, our committee, or when the Prime Minister or whomever, a Premier, announces disasters happening, for example, the floods here and around Ottawa, because it's such a compelling story, should it must, or ourselves must be obliged to provide that kind of interpretation? And does this bill, in this bill, is there that guarantee?
Again, thank you for that question. It has to be must. We want access. We want to know about disasters. For instance, the flood here, there are no public announcements with sign language interpreters. Individuals have no idea what's happening with the flood and potentially could be at risk. So if there are public announcements, it should be provided in our sign languages. It will enable us to protect our home, our apartment, or wherever we are, and to ensure the safety of our fellow citizens. So yes, the answer is must. We must have interpreters. We should be leaders on this front. Mexico is already ahead of the game providing interpreters for announcements. France, UK, Germany, Europe, Eastern Europe, Austria, Russia, they're already providing those kinds of services. And so we are behind the game. We must be providing this, ensuring there's equal access. When there are any live announcements from the Prime Minister, we as deaf citizens want access to that information in our first language, in American Sign Language or Langue Distincte Québécoise.
Thank you. Maybe we could call it American Canadian Sign Language.
You can propose that. Senatrice Eaton.
See, just to continue on with Senator Munson, what are the barriers? Because it seemed like such an obvious thing, and as you raised the New Zealand crisis 2 weeks ago, terrible terrorist attack, you did see the Prime Minister of New Zealand, and you saw a signed person behind her the whole time. Is the barrier simply ignorance? Is it lack of money? Is it lack of federal provincial coordination? What do you think it is, and who, if you were Minister Qualtrough, what country would you look at to set up so that person going into a hospital emergency room, emergency announcements on the TV? I mean, who does it best? And what are the barriers in this country to doing that, to get something set up?
Thank you for your question. The barrier itself, with regards to provincial and federal funding, they don't realize or recognize. For instance, they're unaware. They think that closed captioning is equal access, but that's not their first language. English and French is not their first language. American Sign Language and Langue Distincte Québécoise. So it's an attitudinal barrier. Why do we need to provide sign language interpreters? It's good enough to have captioning, but that is not good enough for our community. It's not our first language. If you want to make a connection to our community, you need to provide it in sign language. In the past, we have telephone, TTY, but that is very slow and cumbersome. And for years, everyone said that was good enough. It took forever for us as Canadians to implement Canadian Video Relay Service, which is real time, which I can finally now, by video, call my doctor, make an appointment, talk to my family,
Just a minute.
call work.
When he calls his doctor.
And so that access, that's my access in my language.
But when he calls his doctor and he can do it on video, is there a person in the doctor's office that can sign back to him?
Well, the interpreters are placed in call centers. And we use this service. There are over 30,000 calls every day. And we call through an interpreter across Canada, and I can make an appointment. So I'll reach them on their phone. So the doctor, the receptionist on the other line will pick up the phone. I will be looking at my app on a computer screen or a mobile device, and I will be signing, and the interpreter will be interpreting for me real time, and then speaking to the receptionist. And this is happening in my own native language. And so it enables a better quality of life because we're recognizing ASL and LSQ sign languages, and that will improve and advance the quality and lives of deaf individuals, deaf Canadians.
And when you actually go to the doctor?
Because originally in the past, I would have to use this cumbersome typewriter and then call a relay operator and converse that way, which took a long time.
But when he actually goes to the doctor, what happens?
When I go to the doctors, they bring in a live sign language interpreter. I have to book that in advance. So, for instance, when I make my call through video relay service and I make an appointment 4 weeks in advance, let's say, for example, I will then ask or request that they book a sign language interpreter. They will make that arrangement, and they will be there and available the day that I appear at my appointment, and there'll be an interpreter there.
Is my time up?
It is. Thank you for your question. And thank you, Mr. Folino, for your answers. Senator Avalia.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you both for your presentations. My question relates to immigrant communities that have assimilated into Canada where, for example, the language of communication may not be ASL or LSQ. So that's the first part of my question for Mr. Folino. And for you, Ms. Wang, do you have culturally sensitive programs with respect to disabilities for immigrant populations? Thank you.
Thank you for your question. We do have new immigrants, many deaf Canadians, and there is that language barrier because that individual may know their own sign language, which is not similar to our American Sign Language. There are over 300 sign languages in the world. So our hope is when Bill C-81 recognizes our sign language, that will then further develop deaf sign language interpreters, and they will become the facilitator to support these new immigrants because they will have a similar cultural understanding and connection with that individual. For instance, at the airport, when new immigrants arrive, there are so many barriers because they can't write in English. They have just newly arrived and they don't know how to communicate. So this will enable the development of deaf interpreters. So we could market that service at airports and enable any new immigrants that are deaf to identify themselves, and then they would then get assistance from these deaf interpreters. Because for new immigrants, they have spoken interpreters readily available at the airport for new immigrants in Chinese and German, various spoken languages. And they're available there at the airport. They're sent right away to be able to communicate with the new immigrants, to communicate in their first language. But when a deaf person arrives, they don't have the same access or this access to the same services, and they don't have that kind of support. So if we want a barrier-free Canada, we encourage the development of deaf interpreters, which then encourages employment for deaf interpreters, and have that service provided at the airport. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Mr. Folino.
Ms. Wang, did you want to answer the second part of the question? Or
Yes, thank you. Thank you for the question. Our Cross Canada network does a lot of research, engaging a lot of different individuals, both older adults and caregivers, in our projects, in our technology development and service and policy and practice development. And we do have specific projects that are engaging Indigenous communities and the French-speaking communities. So it is inclusive of a lot of different communities in Canada, specific to immigrant populations. As far as I know, I don't know a project that is specifically looking at a subset of the population in that who are new immigrants. But a lot of our projects are inclusive of the population of seniors and caregivers, and include them within the research program.
Thank you. Is
Thank
my
you.
time up?
You have very, very limited time. Do you want to wait, maybe? Senator O.
There's an extra.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you, witnesses. And my question was, I'm going to go back to airlines, that was touched by Mr. Folino earlier. For both of you, I have been traveling here and back and forth all the time. I haven't seen too much of a sign language assistance at our airport. And so airline traveling is so critical. It's dangerous, and, safety reason, sign language is important to protect this particular group of citizens. So can you comment on it? What can this bill do to airline traveling and public transport?
Thank you for your question, Senator O. You're correct. It's important to have sign language at the various airports for our safety. There is one airline company that is already enabled or has already provided a video in sign language, but it's actually captioned only, interpreter error, but it should also be in sign language. But the problem is that when you're in an airport, for instance, take myself, for example, I'm sitting in an airport, I can't hear the announcements that a flight has changed or a gate has changed or I need to move or there's been a delay. There is no mechanism to alert me that there's been a change or there's an emergency. So there should be, and we do have the technology to have an alert system on my phone or to alert me, to let me know that there has been a change. And so it needs to be in text and displayed as well as in sign language. There was one international airport that I went to. They had sign language at the airport. So I feel that passing Bill C-81 and recognizing ASL and LSQ will create a barrier-free Canada and will provide accessibility at the airport. When I go to the customer service desk, for instance, or I give my passport to the flight attendant before I get on the plane, we can also have various iPads and use and access BRI technology and access an interpreter live, and then I can communicate efficiently with customer service or with the flight attendant in my own language. So again, I emphasize that CRPD says that written language and spoken languages are equal, and that we need equal to sign languages, pardon me, and that will promote
I'm certainly
the
that
quality of life in Canada.
You use more phone than I do on my flying.
Yes.
And Ms. Wang, do you have any comments?
Thank you. I think there are a lot of opportunities to be able to enhance the accessibility for seniors who are traveling. I know that there are mechanisms in place right now looking at providing assistive mobility. So all of the assistance related to transporting, so moving from one gate to another gate, those are in place. Often what happens, though, I think from the service side, having a greater acknowledgement of people's diversity in abilities would be very, very useful in terms of being able to train people who are working in transport to be more aware and more sensitive to variations in abilities. And so for the part of seniors, for example, it could be that somebody has some delayed response time to different things, or if they have changes in their cognition, things that are moving very, very quickly, they may, having some added training for the service staff would be very useful in terms of being able to accommodate different needs so that the communication is clear. And again, in terms of the technology, more and more in transport, we are relying a lot on technology, and not everybody is as familiar with technology. And so if things are very much reliant on an app to be able to transmit the message for changes in flight times and things like that, that is one very positive way of being able to transmit information. But again, if you don't have the familiarity or you don't own the devices, that potentially could be a detriment in you getting to the right place at the right time. So,
Thank you. Thank you very much. Senatrice Deakin.
Thank you. Thank you, the Chair, and thank you, Mr. Folino and Ms. Wang, for being here today. It's no secret we're working through a really important bill and sort of getting closer and closer to trying to narrow in those pieces that can even bring more strength and more teeth and more perspective to it. So I'm glad you're here today. One of the areas that we continue to think about is the timelines in this bill at its present state. And so I'd like to hear from both of you what you think. There are those that might think having a date established and set doesn't make it strong enough, or it might cause many things to be delayed. Different reasons for different conversations. But I would like to hear what your thoughts are and the advantages, perhaps, of having timelines in this document that we don't see now.
Who wants to jump in?
Sure, I can go first. I think timelines are very useful for accountability, and incorporating them in would be beneficial. I recognize Minister Qualtrow's comments about being able to be flexible with advances in technologies, but also not necessarily if there's a timeline that's placed, people may delay in terms of reaching those timelines. But I think staging them appropriately and realistically, I think, would be a good approach to go.
Thank you. Mr. Folino.
Thank you for your question. I agree. Timelines are very important to put in the bill. It creates accountability to ensure that everyone is following along. My concern, if there is no timeline, they may wait 25 or 30 or 40 years to ensure that they've met their accessibility needs. And that is only going to increase down the road. So we need to encourage timely timelines and have some flexibility within those timelines, but to ensure that they have accountability to meet the demands of the bill. Without that, for example, take Ontario, for example, we have to wait 25 years for it to be fully implemented and barrier-free. And 25 years is too long. That's my concern. The bill right now doesn't address timelines. My concern is it will fall in suit similar to what's happened in Ontario. So when you're doing your line by line, I would encourage you to add timelines tomorrow, up to 5 years, at least to initiate the initial regulations so that we can follow through to the second stage. In law, we need, because when we set up those timelines and then set up those regulations, But if they have no timelines to ensure that the first set of regulations are out, if that's omitted from the bill, then I feel that we may not follow through. That's my concern.
Thank you. Thank you. Do I have a little bit like Middlesex?
Yes.
Okay. I think you've said it, Mr. Folino, the line by line. You've talked about, up to 5 years. My question is really quickly is how strong do you think that timeline language should be?
Well, I don't want it to be too flexible, but I want it to be strict. Like, so in the medium, if you have to ask, like, we need to have that system in place. If that's not there, then it's far too loose and flexible. And I don't want that. I want some structure to ensure that we meet our obligations.
Thank you.
Thank you. Did you have something to add to that? Or? Merci beaucoup. J'ai sénatrice Poirier.
Senator Poirier, Signe and Couture.
Our next panel, sénatrice Poirier.
Madame la Présidente, thank you again both for being here. My first question is for Mr. Folino, if I'm saying that right, and it's a follow-up from Senator, the two previous senators that questioned Senator Eaton, and you mentioned that an example of the doctor, when you go to the doctor, you call this a center or a bunch of different access centers, and they set up the appointment for you in advance so that when you get to the doctor, that there is somebody there that can do the sign language for you so that you'll be able to speak to your doctor. I guess being from a small community in rural New Brunswick, I was just wondering what the services was in that area compared to urban Canada and rural Canada. If you know if the services is available throughout Canada, I'm just wondering down in certain areas, how accessible would it be for the doctor to have somebody to be able to come in and do that? Are you aware of the percentage, if it's available, that service across Canada equally?
Thank you for your question. We have a national association, the Canadian Association of Sign Language Interpreters, CASLI is the acronym, and they roughly have 800 to 900 members, professional sign language interpreters that serve the ASL and LSQ community. And for the French LSQ community, there are roughly 200 interpreters, and they're under the Association of Quebecois of Sign Language, AQILS, and they are both professional associations. So 800 ASL English, 200 LSQ French, so 1,000 roughly interpreters in Canada. So yes, I recognize that that's a small number. So when this bill is passed, the support will be in place to grow that capacity and support programs to produce more sign language interpreters that will enable more opportunities of employment for interpreters and the deaf community in order to facilitate communication. To answer your question about rural areas, there are definitely challenges for in-person interpreting, depending on where they're located, but they could access video remote interpreting. They could connect via video to an interpreter at those appointments. But at the same time, it's undeniably true that we need more sign language interpreters, and we need to grow that capacity. And that will help with the barrier-free Canada recognizing ASL and LSQ.
Okay, thank you. Do you have a little bit of time?
Little bit.
Okay. Totally on a different subject, and the question is for both of you. You both can answer, or if you want to choose one or the other. The new proposed legislation states that there's going to be 4 different bodies that would be responsible for the dealing with the complaints related to the accessibility. And from what we've heard, advocacy groups and accessibility experts have expressed some concerns regarding this and how it might be lead to some confusion. I'd like you to share with us, do you have any concerns regarding the proposed complaints, frameworks in the bill, and if so, why?
question?
Yes. We have similar concerns along with the disabled community. The deaf community also is concerned about where they lodge their complaint. If there are 4 entities, it becomes confusing where to lodge that complaint. There needs to be one door where then they can facilitate where those complaints go. And that will be more efficient and solve the problem instead of putting the onus on us to go to the various bodies and then being told that we've lodged our complaint in the wrong place. That just prolongs the process. It may take 2 or 3 or 4 years to resolve. That's our concern. So we would like one standard, one door to lodge our complaint. So, for instance, the accessibility commissioner could be a solution. The chief accessibility commissioner could receive those complaints and then triage them. And that will help. And that will lessen the anxiety for the disabled and deaf community if you have a streamlined complaint process.
I absolutely agree. Having a very streamlined process will be very useful. From all of the research that we've done related to accessing services for assistive technologies and rehab services as well, having multiple channels where people access services becomes very, very complicated, and people are indicating that they have to repeat their stories multiple times to multiple people, and it is in many cases an assault to their dignity because they have to keep repeating the same thing to different people who at every stage of their discussion may or may not fully understand what their concerns are. And so having one access point where it's triaged in the background, or where their complaint gets put through to the right channels is definitely something that can, I think, improve the lives of people with disabilities.
Thank you. Senatrice Omidvar.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you both of you for being with us. My first question is to Ms. Wang, and then I'd like to hear from Mr. Folino as well. Ms. Wang, you talked about the multiple forms of discrimination that individuals face as they grow older. Could you reflect on the complexity of intersection? When you are aging, you're growing older, you are facing multiple forms of disability possibly as well, but you are also impacted by your race, ethnicity, sexual orientation, etc. Could you tell us a little bit more about what you have observed in your research?
A lot of the research participants that I've been involved with, and from other projects within AgeWell, ageism comes up a lot, related to how people are not necessarily understanding individuals who have Alzheimer's disease or cognitive impairment, people who have multiple forms of like physical concerns in addition to cognitive changes. There's a lot of stigma associated with a lot of age-related types of conditions, and being an older person, individuals have reported that they don't get treated in the same way in terms of being a young, productive person who is in the community. So if they are retired, they often may experience some form of discrimination that is related to not being a productive member of society. And I think that in itself is wrong. Compounded with that, if somebody is experiencing changes within themselves with cognitive impairments, there's a lot of different things that navigating the environment, navigating services becomes much more complicated. And that's on top of issues related to changes in their vision or hearing, which makes it more difficult in navigating different services in the community, and that's compounded with potentially a lot of other issues related to a lot of loss in their social supports. And if there's somebody who had a lower socioeconomic status in terms of the work that they were doing or education, sometimes that is in addition to the other forms of discrimination that they experience.
Thank you. If I may, let me ask Mr. Folino. I'm sure that members of your community, the the Canadian Hard of Hearing Association, experience intersection with their disability in different ways. Do you believe, and there's nothing in the bill about intersectionality, do you believe that we should embed the language of intersectionality into the principles of the bill to ensure that legislators are looking at multiple factors and multiple features of discrimination?
The short answer is yes, absolutely. The deaf community has different intersectionalities. Deaf plus people of color, LGBT, deaf plus disabilities, deaf plus blind, deaf plus... There are many within our community and intersectionalities, and I feel strongly and I would support that mention in our bill, in the principles. During CCD's presentation, Council of Canadians with Disabilities mentioned intersectionality, and we do support that as the Canadian Association of the Deaf.
Thank you. Thank you. Sénatrice Forêt-Nissing.
See, I'll start with you, Ms. Wang. I hosted in my office individuals, very impressive individuals, who were involved in research and work at the Canadian Frailty Network. And they were bringing to light some very insightful elements that disability, although it may not fall categorically within the definition of disability, perhaps should include frailty. Is it your feeling that the definition that's contained in the bill, as it is proposed, the definition of disability, is broad enough to capture the consequences of frailty?
I think they do. Yeah.
Thank you. And to you, Mr. Folino, thank you for your testimony. And I think we all heard a bit of a gasp when you said there were 300 sign languages around the world. And that causes us to be very concerned about ensuring that if we're including or talking about the possibility of including ASL and LSQ as the languages that Canadians use, we're obviously overlooking other languages that Canadians use, sign languages, I should say, that Canadians use. Although I can't imagine that we would be able to, and that we could reasonably expect that everyone should and could be accommodated in Canada in sign language of their native language. But I do wonder how you feel about adding to ASL and LSQ the Canadian Indigenous Sign Language.
Thank you. Yes, I feel that that's important. I do not want to represent or speak for the Indigenous community. I recognize myself as a white individual, and I do support the recognition of Indigenous sign languages as the first settlers of our country. The Indigenous Language Act is in their third reading at the House of Commons right now, and we do support the passage of that act, the C-91, or within Bill C-81, or as Minister Qualtrough mentioned, that there are possible future legislations with the Indigenous recognition of their sign language and the disabled. Just the interpreter's just asking for clarification. They may be developing a future bill, the Indigenous community, First Nations community mentioned that there may be another bill, Indigenous Disabilities Act, that is another place that possibly could recognize Indigenous sign languages. My point is that it should be recognized either in C-91 or C-81 or a future act or in its own Indigenous act.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. And for our last question, I do have Senator Kutcher.
Thank you.
Go ahead.
Thank you so much. You both spoke about the value of innovative technologies as an important tool for helping overcome barriers. Do you know if there are any specific federal programs or initiatives or funding to focus on developing specifically those kind of technologies?
Certainly the HWL network is developing these kinds of technologies. Maybe I can ask for some clarification in terms of...
Well, in the wider sense, are there, for example, there are funding agencies in Canada that specifically fund research into specific areas. Are there some that specifically would look at various technologies for the deaf, for other groups?
There are... NSERC provides funding, but it's an open program in terms of the projects that are being proposed, and so the funding is not certain. It's similar with CIHR. The funding is not certain, but they do fund research that's related to assistive technologies. Yeah, I might have to get back to you on that. Yeah. Also, I think there's a federal collaborative that is mostly industry-driven that supports assistive technologies in, I think, the Research and Innovation Ministry. I can't be sure about that. I can find out. Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Yes,
quickly,
please.
The future technology for the deaf community is video remote interpreting, VRI. It's already developed. So we need to put funds behind that in order to grow that technology, but it's not the only technology. And we can create deaf economic systems with an technological innovation, for instance, production of ASL, LSQ videos, and support that, and they could contract with the federal government to provide that service. And the last example, in the United Kingdom, they have a specific program under BBC News, and they have specific programming 1 or 2 evenings a week specifically for the deaf community. It's deaf programming, deaf videos, culture, news, lives of deaf individuals. It's a dedicated channel, and it's broadcasted all through Europe and Asia, and through the United States and Mexico and South America. And we don't have that here in Canada yet. So we hope with this bill and the recognition of ASL-LSQ, there will be resources and funds supported behind or support this community to enable to then develop that type of technology. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you, colleagues, for your excellent questions. Thank you very much to our witnesses. You've been very helpful in our study of Bill C-81, and we will suspend for only a couple of minutes until we set up the next panel. Thank you so much.